heartened to see the significant interest in this critical issue, trying to better understand the impact of climate change on communities and ultimately better respond to any increase in vulnerabilities to terrorism and violent extremism. Before I invite our eminent speakers to take the floor to open today's session, I would like to cover just a few housekeeping issues. The first is to note that we're currently live on UN Web TV and on WebEx. And so in order to be inclusive of those who are joining us remotely, we'll be taking questions during our question and answer session via the WebEx link. And that includes for people in the room. So for those in the room, you'll find a QR code in the packs in front of you. So please just join that and add questions as we go along. So I'd like to now open with the first session. I'd like to now invite our distinguished member state representative co-sponsors to formally open today's event. And firstly, I'd like to welcome Canada's Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Richard Arbiter. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for also saying we're eminent. I'm not so sure, but we'll see. We'll see. Look, I'm going to say something that is not intended to be controversial, and I think is fairly obvious. And that is that I don't believe, while it sounds like a gross overgeneralization, that there is a human being on the planet that feels that the global suite of tools and programs are sufficient to address climate change and all of its consequences, right? And that is a reality that is the starting point for, I think, this conversation and every conversation about climate. And that leads to, I hope, a necessary humility, both at the state level and at the international level. And from humility, I hope, we move to learning, individual and collective learning. And, you know, my favorite part, with due respect to myself and my colleagues, my favorite part of this agenda is listening to farmers, herders, listening to youth, listening to others. Because the key to learning is understanding, and understanding born by real experience. And our experiences are all different, depending on where we are and the communities in which we live in, and how we are being affected by climate change. So really delighted that we have the opportunity to contribute to a conversation that's based on listening. For our part, we're trying to learn. We're trying to be better, both better contributors and shareholders, but better actors domestically as well. We're set to open the new NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Montreal a little bit later this year to do that kind of cooperation between not only NATO and its allies, but other global partners as well, and to serve as a hub for knowledge sharing and the development of responses to the security challenges that climate change that arise from climate change. So we're really keen to, through this engagement today, further our understanding of what is coming. Obviously, our hope is not to be blindsided. I think it's impossible to be blindsided. We've been in the I told you so phase for quite some time now. So it's really about what you do with the knowledge that you have and how you act on what you've heard. And that, for us, is what today's conversation is about. Just a last point. I was posted to New York a couple decades ago, and I was responsible for international security issues. And oftentimes people ask me, what's the difference, between the early 2000s and now in terms of the breadth of the UN agenda? And I often say it's how much place climate change takes on that agenda, and that is born of reality, right? It's because, as I said when we started, we don't have an effective global approach across all of these areas now. But the other change alongside that is the move away from a siloed approach to these things, right? So in that period, the UNFCCC process was basically the locus through which many governments, including my own, looked at this issue. And there was a group of experts mandated to negotiate within that process. This is not a criticism of UNFCCC, please don't misunderstand me. But I think that we're in the next logical phase where every community of practice needs to understand better how climate change affects that issue, that sector, that area, that part of the world. And so this, to me, is another proof point, another data point of moving from siloed approaches to something that is a bit more holistic, that allows us to leverage the knowledge, insights, and expertise across communities to have a better and more comprehensive approach to the challenges individuals face no matter where they are. So a big thank you to our co-sponsors, of course, as well, from Mozambique and from Norway, and to UNOCT and others who've put this together, and really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks very much.
To turn to Mozambique, to Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary Deputy Permanent Representative of the Republic of Mozambique to the United Nations, Domingos Estevao Fernandez. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Because I'm not eminent as my colleague, I would like on my notes. Madam Chair, I would first of all want to appreciate and thank the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, the United Nations Regional Crime and Justice Research Institute, and the Institute for Economics and Peace for convening this initiative on climate security and violent extremism, from research to climate-based risk assessments and programming. Indeed, we are sadly witnessing a growing trend of terrorism over the world. Terrorism does not only pose a serious threat to the international peace and security, it also directly affects the well-being of people and countries living under the most vulnerable condition of climate change. The negative synergy between these two crises affects normal functioning of state institutions and global governance at large. There are many concurring factors: floods, cyclones, and droughts resulting from climate change lead to a scarcity of natural resources, food insecurity, displacement, and forced migration, aggravating the risk of conflicts. Moreover, science has just proven that there is a correlation between rising of global temperature and a wave of conflicts in communities. The arid zones, small islands with sea level rise, and high altitude regions are among the most affected. The compounded effects of terrorism and climate change has clearly contributed to growing global fragility, insecurity, political instability, and economic weakness. The instrumentalization of the effects of climate change and other development challenges, with emphasis on the Youth Employability Index, makes communities, especially young people, vulnerable to recruitment by terrorist groups. Extremist groups have long used poverty, dissatisfaction, and economic desperation as an argument to entice fighters and recruit new members. Recent studies published by the United Nations University Center for Policy Research indicate that there is a correlation between a rise of 0.5 degrees in global temperature and the probability of 10 to 20% of occurrence of conflicts, pointing as evidence the regions of Sahel and the Horn of Africa. While terrorism is a global threat, the situation in Africa is particularly critical. The 2023 Global Terrorism Index shows that the Sahel region accounts for about 43% of deaths caused by terrorism. And on the other side, according to the Red Cross, climate change and armed conflict are the two factors causing the suffering of communities in the Sahel region. Forced displacement because of desertification and other climate change impacts are observed in the region, resulting in the loss of land and livestock. To a mainly pastoralist and agrarian population, this constitutes an existential threat. Mali alone has shown a very dire situation. The country lost 90,000 hectares of land, and more than 3 million people were affected in 2021 because of the drought, which caused about 10.5% reduction in cereal production throughout the country. So this is serious. Changing this scenario requires a collective, coherent, and relentless response by placing climate-related security risks in conflict prevention strategies. The estimated costs of adaptation are high, ranging from 10 to 40 billion American dollars. So climate change and terrorism, therefore, require a comprehensive approach. Many of the world's poorest countries and communities cannot afford climate change adaptations, measures, and strategy. Otherwise, the connection between climate change and violent conflicts will only be deepened and grow stronger. We hope that this debate is an excellent contribution to raising the awareness of member states, United Nations entities, donors, civil society organizations, among others, about the importance and the need in recognition of the link between climate change and violent extremism. It is important for policymakers to assess the value of integrating climate-related security risks into conflict prevention strategies and the UN early warning systems and tools to enable a coherent, global, and coordinated response with a gender-sensitive approach and the inclusion of youth in development processes, conflict prevention, and governance in countries most vulnerable to climate change. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I would like to invite Ambassador Odd Stalheim, the Deputy Permanent Representative and Chargé d'Affaires at the Permanent Mission of Norway to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sina and Sian and Richard, Domingo. It's great to be here and to be co-host together with UNODC and UNICRI and the Institute for Peace, Economics and Peace. And I'm also very pleased to see how many have found the way here and are also joining digitally for this event. Climate-related security is certainly an area that Norway puts great importance on and attaches a great concern to. Indeed, it was one of the cross-cutting priorities that we had during our tenure in the UN Security Council, which ended in December last year, and we continue to prioritize this field in the Peace-Building Commission. We know that climate change exacerbates vulnerabilities throughout the world. This dynamic helps explain why many climate-vulnerable countries are also dealing with terrorist insurgencies. However, as with all climate and security issues, these interlinkages are complicated and highly context-specific. Climate change can accelerate the same underlying drivers as those identified as drivers of terrorism. It drives displacement, weakens governance, and fuels political and social instability. It drives food insecurity and hunger, competition over resources, and increases tensions among communities. And it undermines livelihoods and exacerbates inequality. Combined, these factors can create fertile ground for radicalization, spur recruitment to armed groups, and can hinder return of populations that were forced to migrate. The underlying factor is fragility. Climate change undermines the ability of communities to cope with crisis. And many of the communities hardest hit by both climate change and conflict are already the least equipped to deal with their impacts. Additional research is required to better understand these complex linkages, and crucially, to grasp how they are experienced and perceived by the vulnerable communities that are suffering their consequences. Last fall, the Norwegian mission hosted an event on climate change, security risk, and violent extremism in the Sahel, where UNICRI and SWISSAID presented a report on local perceptions of climate change and violent extremism in Chad. Today, we look forward to hearing perspectives from farmers, herders, fishers, and youth across the globe and examining innovative approaches and technical support systems that are helping to both understand and respond to climate insecurity. And I agree very much with Richard that, for me, this is the pièce de résistance of this event. Thank you.
Great. Thank
you very much. To our distinguished co-sponsoring member states, it is again a pleasure to have you here with us today and to be collaborating with you on this side event. My own name is Oren McCarthy. I am UNICRI's liaison representative here in New York, and I have the distinguished pleasure to be able to introduce you to the next part of our side event and to introduce you to our first of many substantive speakers for today. First up, we have Mr. Thomas Morgan. Tom is the Associate Director of Research at the Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP, and is the Research Manager for the Global Peace Index and the Global Terrorism Index. Tom will help us set a little bit the scene for the rest of the discussion today and for the following subsequent presenters, and will talk to us about some of the recent work conducted by IEP on mapping changing ecological conditions against violent extremism and conflict. Following this, we'll be moving to an online presenter, and we will have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Siobhan O'Neill. Siobhan leads the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict MIAC project at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. Siobhan has previously worked in counter-terrorism and homeland security, helping states and local governments to build their capacities to detect, prevent and recover from terrorist attacks, and has advised the US Congress on counter-terrorism policy and practice. Siobhan will talk to us about armed group recruitment and the emerging evidence of the connection with climate change, reflecting on some of their own work in the MIAC project in terms of climate vulnerable and conflict-affected areas. So before handing over to Tom to take us into his presentation, just a quick reminder that we will be saving questions and answers until the very end for the dedicated Q&A section. And to use, if you are interested in presenting a question, please scan the QR code and to drop your question into the chat. So with that, I will hand over to Tom. The floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for our colleagues in UNOCT and UNICRI, as well as the member states, Mozambique, Canada, and Norway, for helping organise this event and being part of it. I'll just give a very brief introduction to the Institute for Economics and Peace. IEP is a research organisation dedicated to quantifying peace and its benefits. We produce composite indices of peace and conflict at the global, national and subnational level, and a large part of our research program focuses on better understanding the drivers of conflict, whether they be social, political, economic, or increasingly environmental. So this presentation draws chiefly on research conducted by IEP in two of our core research reports, the Global Terrorism Index and the Ecological Threat Register. And so the sort of purpose of the presentation is just to give an overview of trends in terrorism and climate data, particularly over the past 6 months, to better frame the discussions we'll hear going forward. So the presentation will focus on 3 areas, so trends in terrorism and conflict, trends in climate-related data and ecological threats, and then a brief overview of the conflict-climate nexus and how this can be best visualised with geospatial data, along with a brief suggestion for a possible path forward in climate conflict research and mapping. It'll primarily focus on the most recent trends in terrorism and climate data in the Central Sahel region up until the end of May 2023. So we begin by looking at the trends in deaths from terrorism since 2007. Overall, the number of deaths from terrorism has declined significantly since its peak in 2015, with terrorism related to the Syrian civil war and also in northeastern Nigeria, with total deaths from terrorism falling around 40% between 2015 and 2023. However, as the total number of deaths from terrorism has declined, the epicenter of terrorism has shifted from the Middle East and North Africa and parts of South Asia into sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel region in particular. So, as was mentioned before, in 2022, 43% of all deaths from terrorism occurred in this region, the majority occurring in the tri-border region of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Terrorism in this region is very strongly correlated with violent conflict more broadly. So in 2022, over 20% of all active conflict pairings globally, which includes both state and non-state groups, were situated in the Sahel. So even when we look at just at the Sahel region, we can see shifts in the distribution of terrorism over time, particularly over the past 5 years. From 2012 to 2015, the vast majority of terrorist activity in the region took place in northeastern Nigeria. Since then, there's been a sharp increase in terrorism in the Central Sahel region, particularly the tri-border area, to the point that it accounts for over 90% of all deaths in the Sahel from terrorism in 2022. Violent non-state actors in this region have continued to evolve and shift and merge, forming alliances with one another, and what were once primarily local conflicts have been drawn into much broader ideological currents. Next slide. So this slide in particular looks at deaths from terrorism in just the Central Sahel region over the past year, from June 2022 to May 2023. Terrorism activity has continued to intensify in the tri-border region over this period, particularly in Burkina Faso, which recorded 919 deaths from terrorism from just the period January to May 2023, which is a 96% increase over the same time period a year prior. The vast majority of these attacks have not been attributed to a specific group. 70% have been attributed to undetermined global jihadist groups, although it's likely that the majority of these attacks were committed by forces aligned with JNIM. By contrast, we've seen a slight decline in the level of terrorism over the past 6 months in Mali and Niger, although there has been an increase in other forms of violence, political violence, and violence against civilians. Yeah, so next slide. So given the surge in the level of violent conflict in the region, obvious next step is to be looking at how the drivers of conflict have been shifting over the same period. So to measure the possible impacts of climate change and ecological and environmental threats, IEP uses something called the Ecological Threat Register, which looks at food security, water security, demographic pressures, extreme weather events, and disaster-related population displacement. So go to the next slide. So you can see this map is a map of the Ecological Threat Register from 2022, which takes into account all those factors just mentioned. As you can see, sub-Saharan Africa faces by far the highest average level of ecological threat of any region globally. So we go on to the next slide and looking at the Ecological Threat Register in the Sahel region in particular. So where there's particularly high levels of ecological threat in Niger and Nigeria. The total impact of extreme weather events and natural disasters has also risen sharply over the past 15 years. So the latest MDAT data suggests that 35 million people in the region were strongly impacted by extreme weather events and natural disasters in 2022. So one of the most pressing issues in the region over the past year has been the increase in food prices and projected food insecurity. So this chart shows the average wholesale food prices for millet and sorghum in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In 2022, there was a considerable spike in food prices across all those countries related to the ongoing effects of the conflict in Ukraine. Although food prices have dropped over the past 6 months, they're yet to return to pre-2022 levels. And indeed, over the past month, so just in May 2023, there's been a sharp increase in prices, most noticeably in Mali. So as a result of this increase in food prices, ongoing climate issues, seasonal variation in rainfall, and difficulties in planting crops owing to ongoing conflict and security issues has led to a considerable rise in projected food insecurity for the coming months. So we see here projected food insecurity for the June-August period last year, and then for June-August last year, and now projected for June-August this year. So compared to the same period last year, projected food insecurity is noticeably higher in the tri-border region, with multiple regions facing crisis or emergency levels of food insecurity, meaning that at least 20% of the population face food consumption gaps, high or very acute malnutrition, and are forced to sell assets to meet food needs. So with regards to rainfall in the Central Sahel, there's considerable discussion and debate around how longer-term trends in rainfall have been connected to desertification. World Bank data for the period 1901 to 2021 actually suggests that there's been some recovery in rainfall levels over the past 40 years. When we look more specifically, data for the past few months show that rainfall is below historical averages in some parts of the tri-border region, although according to the Famine Early Warning System West Africa Seasonal Monitor, precipitation is expected to expand northward for an average rainy season across the Sahel with good moisture conditions for crops. So that's sort of a summary of the existing data, particularly over the last 6 months in conflict and terrorism and climate-related data. So how can this data be used to better show the connection between conflict and climate and environmental issues? So I think firstly it's worth briefly recapping the nature of the connection between climate issues and conflict. Although there's a very broad expert consensus that climate issues can and do drive conflict, often acting as a threat multiplier, the strength of this connection and the exact mechanisms and pathways by which climate and environmental variables lead to conflict is disputed. Some studies have shown a direct connection between temperature increases and conflict risk. We had this study mentioned before from 2015, which finds that for every half a degree of warming was associated with an increased conflict risk of 10 to 20%. However, other studies have only found an increased risk for societies already in conflict, with no increase in the risk of conflict onset. Now, if we're looking at studies for the Sahel region specifically, a study from 2020 found that a 1-degree increase in warming led to a 54% increase of conflict risk in mixed-use areas, so where we have farmers and herders, where competition for resources increases. However, I think it's worth pointing out that some analysts have suggested that there is too much focus on climate as a risk factor to the detriment of social and political considerations, noting that the majority of researchers agree that political and social variables have a much stronger direct impact on conflict onset in the short run. Concerns have also been raised about sampling bias in climate conflict research, whereas only areas already in conflict are focused on, ignoring areas facing severe climate conditions that are not currently in conflict and not likely to be in conflict in the near future. It's also been noted that the connection between food insecurity and conflict is particularly complex, and that in periods of extremely high food insecurity are often associated in the short run actually with reductions in conflict. So given this uncertainty, I want to suggest two possible uses for geospatial data to highlight the conflict-climate nexus and those connections between environmental issues and conflict. So the first way is fairly straightforward, overlaying of conflict and environmental variables. We see here an example of a 2x2 threat matrix that shows short-term concerns across both dimensions. The map here shows recent terrorist activity and food insecurity, so terrorist activity over the past 6 months and projected food insecurity over the next 3 months. So it highlights those areas that have both high levels of terrorist activity and high levels of food insecurity. There are 4 areas in the administrative 1 level in the Sahel region that are facing both high levels of terrorism activity and high levels of food insecurity. This is a fairly straightforward and simple example, but complexity can be added by looking at the dynamics of terrorism and climate risk over time through the use of heating and cooling maps, or by looking at more disaggregated data to map risk at a more granular level. So the final slide before we hear from others is a suggestion of another way of analysing climate and conflict data. The second way that geospatial data can be used is to focus more on subnational localised data to give a better understanding of the very short-term dynamics related to conflict and environmental variables. So the maps on this slide are illustrations of an approach used in a paper by Sean Cohenline and Corin on conflict in the transition zone in the central Sahel region. Their approach uses very localized data using the PRIO grid system, which captures conflict and climate variables at the half-degree grid level, so roughly 55 kilometres by 55 kilometres. It draws on a data set created and released about a year ago called AfroGrid, which combines climate, environmental and conflict variables at the monthly rather than the yearly level in order to better track and understand how these variables interact. So an example of how they use this data, their research proposes a model in which armed conflict groups need both opportunity and motive to target resources and commit acts of violence. Therefore, they suggest that violence is more likely to occur within this transition zone where harsh climate conditions are paired with more variable environmental conditions, which in this case means where monthly vegetation levels fluctuate above and below a given threshold for at least 1 month a year. They found, when controlling for a range of other factors, that environmental security and agricultural abundance, as environmental security and agricultural abundance increases, that's when you're likely to see violent conflict over resources increase. So in the period in where you have harsh climatic conditions, as agricultural abundance increases in the following months, that's when you're more likely to see escalations in violence. So thus there may be a more localized and cyclical element to the climate conflict ecological nexus that has been potentially overlooked or under-researched up until now. So this is just one example of how more granular, timely, and freely available geospatial data can be used to better understand conflict and climate dynamics.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, for that absolutely fantastic presentation. Very, very important and insightful for us in terms of setting the scene and providing the data and the evidence for us to take this discussion forward. So with that, I'll now hand over to our colleague online, Dr. Siobhan O'Neill, who'll talk to us a little bit about, as I said, about armed group recruitments and some of the work being conducted by UNIDIR through the MIAC initiative. So over to you, Dr. Siobhan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me today. And thanks to Mozambique, Norway, Canada, and UNOCT for sponsoring this important discussion. If you could put my slides up, that would be great. So just as the slides are going up, just to say that this is the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project, which seeks to understand how and why people become involved in a whole array of armed groups, what their experience is like in the group, and how and why they exit, to inform not only prevention programming, but DDR and reintegration interventions as well to help people transition to civilian life after armed group involvement. And a special shout out to Norway as a historical donor and Canada as a current donor supporting this work, so thank you. We never set out to be a climate security project, but we have a really holistic approach in trying to understand involvement. And so in the regions where we work, it is inevitable that we have to ask questions about the impact of climate change and environmental degradation due to human activity as well. So we'll move to the next slide. So we often hear about how climate change is a threat multiplier. And the goal here is to go a little bit beyond that correlation or the sort of vague relationship and try to better understand at the individual level how the lived experience of dealing with climate change could enhance your vulnerability and make it more likely that you might become recruited or associated to an armed group, including listed terrorist groups. And so we recognize that this is not a direct relationship. So the temperature doesn't rise 2 degrees and people say, that's it, I'm going to go out and join this rebel group. What happens is climate change likely enhances their vulnerability through a number of different intermediary mechanisms. And that makes them more likely to be exposed to or vulnerable to recruitment efforts. So some of those intermediary mechanisms that we could think about would be things like displacement. People who are displaced, who have nowhere to live, who may have lost their livelihood, or who are displaced into an area related to conflict, those are people that maybe become more vulnerable. When climate change increases conflict over shrinking natural resources, you can understand that relationship, or the loss of livelihood, and maybe looking for a paycheck or even just to put food on the table for your family. And that's one of the areas we've really focused on, is the loss of livelihood in our work and the relationship between climate-related difficulties making a livelihood and recruitment into different types of armed groups. Next slide, please. So since 2018, we've been doing this work, and it's really an all of UN effort to work with all of the major entities who are doing reintegration type interventions. And UNOCT has sat on our advisory group for many years, so thank you for all the advice and counsel you provided in that forum. Since 2020, we have been operating large-scale, multi-dimensional studies in all of these areas, 6 countries in total, 4 in the Lake Chad Basin, in Iraq, and in Colombia. We do large-scale survey work, we do qualitative work, experimental work, and we do participatory work. And I think the real value add, the real innovation is that we do longitudinal panels with ex-combatants and their unaffiliated peers over time to really understand how they transition to civilian life. And in that process, we ask a lot of questions about what life was like before they got recruited. And we ask very similar questions to non-affiliated peers about what was life like just before the conflict affected your community. And in doing so, we can really isolate some of the factors that are statistically significant in enhancing one's probability to recruitment. And I'm going to run you through a couple of the data points that we have and how we've approached this. And again, I think this is really an emerging field, and there's really no agreed way that you would try to approach this or isolate this, but I'll give you some insights into how we've approached it thus far and what we've seen. Next slide, please. So we focus predominantly, although not exclusively, on loss of livelihood. So the role of climate change or environmental degradation on loss of livelihood and the impact of that subsequently on recruitment or association. We also looked a bit at displacement as well. So this is our general approach. So first we asked everybody that we've ever interviewed about if they noticed very specific climatic shifts. contextualized for the particular location. So if it's in the Lake Chad Basin region, particularly in Chad, we ask about lake levels, if they're involved in fishing. That's really important. We ask about change in temperature, change in the dry season, the rainy season, Harmattan, you name it. So depending on where we are, we ask very specific indicators of climatic shifts. If someone says that they have noticed climatic shifts before the conflict began or before they were recruited, we ask if they ever impacted their livelihood or someone close to them. And if they said yes, we ask them if they or anyone they know ever joined an armed group because of these challenges. For ex-combatants and former armed group associates, we ask them if they answered yes to this series of questions, if these were among the reasons that they got involved in their armed group. And just to say that we know that armed group involvement is really multi-causal, so it's never the only reason. It's usually combined and complex cocktail of reasons that's very individualized, even when there are trends that are pretty widespread, including like climatic shifts that affect a lot of people. Okay, so on to some of the evidence that we've collected. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I'll just share in the Lake Chad Basin. When we've asked these questions, it's extremely clear that climate-related difficulties, farming, herding, or fishing are fairly widespread across the population, and particularly in Cameroon and Chad, as you can see here, when it comes to changes in the lake and average rainfall. For those who've experienced these challenges, many of them know people who subsequently joined armed groups because of a similar experience. And if you can just kind of get a feel for that distribution, 16% in Nigeria, 57% in Niger from the population, as I switch to the next slide, you'll see that the perception of many people who may not be associated themselves really maps on to what we hear from ex-combatants and former armed group associates themselves. So if you could go to the next slide, of those individuals who'd been with an armed group and had acknowledged difficulties maintaining a livelihood because of climate change, many of them did recognize that this was one of the reasons, or one among many reasons, that they became involved themselves. And it's not just groups like Boko Haram, JAF, ISWAP, the various factions, but also community security providers like the CJTF, Yangora, and other vigilante groups. So this has, an effect of making people vulnerable and looking for a different way to support themselves and their families. We did follow-up interviews with some of the individuals who said that this was one of the reasons that they had joined Boko Haram. And it was interesting because you got very different stories about how this worked in practice and what the lived experience was. So you can see the quote here. For this individual, it was really about access. There had been massive flooding, and suddenly the armed group controlled the areas where you could continue to farm. And so for that individual, you needed to be associated to get access to land. We have another interview where someone talks about their crops failing because of lack of rainfall, and they really were food insecure. They were starving. Then we have someone else who was displaced because of high windstorms that hit their area in one of these sort of freak weather events. And so we have very different reasons, but again, this loss of livelihood or displacement seemed to be the intermediary vulnerability factor that enhanced their likelihood and brought them into contact or made it important to engage with an armed actor. And this is something that we see in every place that we work. I'm going to move on to the next slide and just tell you a little bit about the work in Iraq. We've done large-scale work across the country, and we've been looking at things like PMF reintegration, but also families returning from Northeast Syria who are perceived as ISIL-affiliated because they potentially have an ISIL-affiliated family member or someone in their family who's been arrested on these charges. And so across the region, you see that respondents are really affected by changes in the climate. They notice them at highly significant rates, and they often cite knowing someone who themselves joined a different type of armed actor. So not necessarily just ISIL, but the groups that rose up to try to fight ISIL because of these livelihood challenges related to climate change. And I was also in Erbil recently and hearing about the reintegration of women coming back from Northeast Syria and really struggling because they themselves had been farmers and had gone back to farming and they really weren't able to make ends meet. So it's something not only on the recruitment prevention side that we need to be thinking about, but also on the reintegration side. I'm going to move on to Colombia next, if we could switch slides. In Colombia, we looked at climatic shifts, but we also looked at environmental degradation due to human activity, particularly illegal mining, deforestation, etc., because that's such a huge issue there. And we find that this affects not just rural respondents, but it affects them more, but also urban respondents too see the effects of climate change. We see that it has an impact on displacement, but we also see that it has an impact on recruitment across different types of groups, and not just climate change, but human-induced environmental degradation, which are operating in this sort of cyclical fashion. So that's especially problematic in this particular case. We see that when people acknowledge climate change and these kind of difficulties, they often know of people who've suffered similarly and who themselves have become affiliated with an armed actor as a result. And when we ask FARC, ELN, and AUC members, they often talk about this as well. 19% across a fairly small sample, a couple hundred talked about sort of this being related to their involvement as well. So across these case studies, we see that climate change related difficulties and vulnerabilities, and the main focus we've had thus far has been on livelihood loss or livelihood challenges, although we're expanding to try to better understand issues related to displacement and conflict over resources, although I don't think it's necessarily limited to just those intermediary factors, and to try to better understand how that impacts human decision-making when people are very vulnerable and they don't have a lot of options. And I think this has significant policy and programming implications. So I'll just go to my next slide and I'll wrap up very quickly. This really should impact how we think about prevention and how we think about reintegration. And those types of interventions should be climate aware and climate sensitive. And you could think about this in lots of different ways. And I think about this when I've seen agricultural patches in some of these transition centers, people leaving armed groups and going back to civilian life, and wondering, are those small garden patches actually full of climate-resistant plants? Are they learning sort of cutting-edge irrigation practices? Or are we thinking about maybe training people in different types of livelihoods if the land can no longer sustain the type of farming that maybe historically their communities were used to? And in many places, I think Colombia is a great example where we think about there's other aspects to this as well. And sometimes that's just reinforcing a non-military state presence. Sometimes that's local dispute mechanisms. That's clearly a huge issue across the Sahel as well, as these conflicts over increasingly limited resources overwhelm traditional dispute resolution mechanisms. That's something that will be increasingly important to address them so you don't see these outbursts of conflict. So I think there's lots of different ways that we can think about climate sensitivity and making sure all the work that the UN does to prevent and respond to conflict always adopts that angle at every point. And lastly, I'll just say, if you go to the next slide, I just have a couple QR codes for a couple of our publications that deal with some of this data. We very much see this, and I really appreciated Ambassador Arbeiter's point. We are trying to learn. So I don't think that we've necessarily got it right. I'm not a climate scientist, but we really want to understand the lived and human experience of being in these situations and being proximate to armed groups, and how people decide how they're going to move forward so that we can take that evidence and that evolving learning and inform our efforts, that suite of tools, as you said, and we can adjust them in real time to be more effective, to prevent conflict and to effectively respond to it. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Siobhan. Getting a little feedback. Thank you very much, Siobhan. That was absolutely excellent. With that, we wrap up the first part of our side event, which we really wanted to just set the scene, provide the evidence of this connections, and really to kind of, as I said, lay the foundation for us to now hear from the next section, where we will start listening to the voices of those who've been affected. So with that, I'll now hand over to Sian, who will take us further.
Thank you, Oren. So now, as Oren said, we're now turning to our panel discussion, which is on hearing those insights from communities who are already affected by climate change and impacted by increased vulnerabilities to violent extremism. Often in discussions about emerging threats in CT and PCVE, the people who are most affected are not at tables like this to share their insights and their ideas. So it was really important to us that we included these voices in this discussion today. And in fact, as we heard in the plenary session yesterday in CT Week, this is really the way to build fit-for-purpose capacity building. So this will be a panel in two parts. The first part is we will hear from our colleague at UNICRI, who will showcase UNICRI's latest research that listens to farmers, herders and fishers. And the second part of the panel, we will hear from those people who are often really disproportionately impacted by climate insecurity, and that's young people. So firstly, I'd like to share the floor with Ms. Manuela Brunero from UNICRI. Manuela is a program officer in the Counter-Terrorism unit at UNICRI, where she is responsible for projects, research and capacity building activities in the field of the prevention of violent extremism. Manuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sian. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss with you all today this critical topic. So in my short intervention, while the slides are uploading, I would like to try to give you some insights from the local communities, from the farmers, the herders, the fishers that we have interviewed in Chad for a research that we conducted, a research that aimed to better understand the indirect linkages between climate change and violent extremism. Next slide, please. So as we know, the climate insecurity is considered a risk multiplier rather than a direct cause of violence. And we wanted to focus specifically on how the effects of climate change are perceived, are felt by the local community, and what their perception are concerning the impact of climate change on their main productive activities, but also on the social cohesion of their communities. And then we try to analyze how this is being used by violent extremist groups' propaganda. Next slide. So what are the key findings? Well, trying to really summarize into 3 main points. Well, first of all, during our field visits, all the communities widely reported an increased economic and survival pressure. And this is due to the fact that their main livelihood activities are suffering from the climate change effects. The second point is that the competition for ever-shrinking resources has led to increased conflict, deadly violence within and between communities, causing a breakdown in the social cohesion. And third point is that while it is important to stress that the effects of climate change are not directly linked to violent extremist groups' recruitment technique, it is clear that they have been instrumentalized. So next slide. So as you can imagine, the respondents to our interview experienced different and various kind of effects of climate change, from disruption of rainfall cycles to desertification and so on. So we don't have the time to go into the details, but just to give you an example, these pictures show a sand encroachment on an agricultural land. And according to the owner, the previous year, he had grown per millet on the same plot. So in less than 1 year, the same plot has been covered with sand and now is completely unusable. So we can all imagine and we can all understand how this effect impacts the community's main economic and productive activities. Next slide. Here we have just included a few quotes trying to give voice to the farmer, to the herders interviewed, that I think are quite self-explanatory and underline the difficulties faced by both groups. For instance, one farmer stated, it's hard to find farming land these days. People don't even sell land here anymore. Or the herders that say the situation is difficult this year. I've lost 1 cow and a goat already. it will only get worse in the coming months. Next slide. This, of course, this economic and survival pressure bring us to the next point. That is exactly the effect on conflict and on social cohesion of the communities. Regardless of the activities, whether farming, herding, or fishing, all the different communities interviewed express fear and anxiety for survival. You can see here we have all failed crops. We are fearful for our children. So, of course, we are talking about population who are already living in a very precarious condition. And in this context, conflict that may otherwise have been manageable, now with the anxiety, if the person becomes fearful, then this conflict have all the potential to explode. And unfortunately, it's what is happening. Next slide, please. Every economic group that we have interviewed, as well as local or traditional authorities, reported an increased conflict and deadly violence within and between communities. For example, this quote is from a traditional authority that mentioned that the clashes between herders and farmers are commonplace. The herders who come in search of water or grazing lands for their herds devastate the fields. Not much more than a week ago, there was a clash here, resulting in 3 dead and 3 persons injured on our side, and 1 dead on one side of the herders. Next slide, please. So, what is the impact on the dynamic of violent extremism? Again, I would start with a quote, this one, that is the interviewee who recounted the case of a particularly pointed appeal in which Boko Haram, a Boko Haram member has to a young person kidnapped, what is the profitability of fishing per day? What is certain, it is very weak. With us, it is with the American dollar that you will be paid. So we all know that groups such as Boko Haram have long used poverty and economic desperation as an argument to recruit new members. And next slide, please. And the financial incentives and the promises of a better future to people that, again, are living in vulnerable economic conditions have proven particularly successful in recruiting. For example, in a village, an interviewee recounts these recruitment methods. People working for Boko Haram came here to meet the parents of some youth. They promised them things, and the parents were so naive that they even encouraged others to join. This is what used to happen. So, of course, this strategy may prove even more successful in a context where public services are often extremely limited. And indeed, there is an example of this interviewee who claimed that here in our village, people are poor. So if people like Boko Haram are offering them a better life, then why not to join them and at least get some food? Look around you at the situation we are in. There is no water to drink, nothing to eat. Would you accept these harsh living conditions? So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Manuela. We're a bit short on time, but I do want to ask you one very quick follow-up question. You've got a room here of people who are experts and practitioners and decision makers on this topic. What would be the one takeaway that you'd really like people to walk away from your research in the sense of how this is really a risk or a vulnerability in relation to violent extremism?
Thanks. Well, I think also from the previous presentation, it's clear that there are these linkages between climate change and radicalization, violent extremism, recruitment, and of course this is highly contextualized. So I'm talking about this particular region of the world that is Sahel. If I have to choose a takeaway, I think that in terms of future programming, I believe it would be important when designing PVE policies and strategies to take into consideration climate challenges. At the same time, I think it is also equally important to avoid an instrumentalization of climate change to justify responses that overly securitize the issue, or on the other hand, to justify lack of actions. because we all know there are different drivers to violent extremism, and the majority are not related to climate change or to climate insecurity. So I think it's important for the programming to take these two aspects into consideration and find a good balance.
Thank you, Manuela. That's super useful. Now it gives me really great pleasure to introduce two of UNOCT's Global Programme on PCV's Youth Engagement and Empowerment Programme alumni from 2022's South and Southeast Asian Programme, which lasted for 6 months last year. Two really standout alumni that we have with us today. The programme itself works with young people around the world to use a peer-to-peer model of engagement to reach not just the young people like Javeria and Dennis, who we'll meet soon, but in their own communities as well, and to really kind of design and develop youth-led and youth-designed PCVE policy and programming solutions. So the two leaders that we have with us today, I'd like to introduce. The first is Mr. Dennis Lalianzuel. Dennis is an Indigenous conflict survivor and a displaced young person belonging to the Hamar community living in Manipur, northeast India. Dennis is a 2022 UNCCT YEEP alumni, and he's also the founder of the Bridge School project, which is a youth-led community initiative focusing on education and peace building, working with children and young people affected by conflict and disasters. We're also joined by Ms. Javeria Keller, a young feminist who belongs to a minority community in Pakistan. She is passionate about intersectional environmentalism and communal Indigenous psychologies. Javeria is also a 2022 YEEP alumni, and she currently is a program officer for the Halo Trust, working at the intersection of humanitarian demining and conservation in Angola. So I'm going to open with a question, and I'll start with you, Dennis, before I go to Javeria. Dennis, the question is, who are you? Can you explain a little bit more about you and the work that you do? And can you tell us about how climate security has affected you and your peers?
Good afternoon, everyone. On 4th of May 2023, just a month ago, I narrowly escaped death from a mob who vandalized the homes where I lived. I fled with nothing with a backpack, helping elders from the building to escape, together climbing a high wall. We hid in a small room for hours, miraculously saved by a security of a police officer who just lived next door. And I found myself living in a refugee relief camp for 4 days. Thousands of houses burned and over 70,000 people forced to be internally displaced in Manipur, northeast India. I became the target. Why? Because I belong to a particular ethnic minority whose identity is deeply woven with its land. I am fortunate to have survived and to share with you today my story of conflict, of hope, and the opportunity to remind us of the immense power we have together as a global community. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am Dennis Lalianzuel, an Indigenous youth, a conflict survivor, and a displaced youth just a month ago. My community, the Mar tribe, falls under the Zo umbrella, an Indigenous group of people whose identity is intrinsically linked to our land. Our social system, our cultures, our way of life are innately around the land in the hills. The recent ethnic conflict that I was a witness to opens the complexity of climate security and conflict hand in hand. The fault line issues of land and forest rights in my region has resulted in 100 lives lost, displacement crossing 70,000 and growing at the moment, and violence continues. Young people who are enduring this violence are at the risk of losing their potential, which could have lifelong consequences. Every single number that I am talking now represents a multitude of lives that are intricately intertwined and profoundly infected by conflict. And I am one of those numbers. And I am here today to share what it means to survive a conflict related to climate security. With this experience, I can say the absence of climate justice poses a wide-ranging consequences, both direct and indirect, on young people like me, and it can shatter our lives and the security of our future. Climate security simply for me means safe ownership of my land and its natural resources. And when access to this is threatened or threatened to be taken away, it makes me and my peers vulnerable to displacement, which could be a forced one, a loss of hope and the potentials that we have. It could result in social unrest and conflict that threatens human security. This could result in radicalization and eventually for some of them, extremism, which is seen at the moment in my own region and myself as a displaced youth today. So Sian, this is who I am today, what I am facing, and what is currently happening with at the margins of young people who are displaced in terms of mostly relating to conflict and climate security. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. I think it's such an important point you raise about not just the loss of land, but potentially the loss of hope for young people, which is a very concerning thing. Javeria, I'd like to now throw the question to you, and the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, and everyone joining us online. Good evening and boa tarde. My name is Javeria Kella, and I come from a desert area in Pakistan called Thar Parkar. It essentially borders Rajasthan in India, which also encompasses the larger amount of Thar Desert. So Thar Desert is it's actually the most inhospitable ecoregions in the Indo-Pacific region, but it also happens to be the only fertile and the most widely densely populated deserts in the world. Now, as you can imagine, a very harsh landscape, but also very beautiful landscape. The indigenous communities there have essentially always relied on their natural environment and landscape and each other to survive. The ecology of Thar Parkar is deeply embedded in our Thari identity through folklore, textile, food, rituals, faith, languages, really the list goes on. What I'm trying to bring home is the idea that Thar and being Thari is not just an identity, it is really part of our bodies and how we inhabit the world and our ecologies. I am not Thari without Thar. It is really just a part of who I am as a person. With so many different indigenous communities within Thar Parkar, there's one thing that always united us and still does is the ecology of that land or desert. The human and even the non-human are so intricately one and are part of us that is exactly what makes Thar what it is. And this, excellencies and distinguished guests and everyone online, is the understanding of ecology that I grew up with. Now, fast forward with the discovery of 175 billion tons of lignite coal came this disastrous idea of developing the country with extraction and extractive industry in Thar. Now, there is a multi-billion dollar project that has resulted in displacement, resulted in loss of livelihoods. Essentially, what has happened is the very social fabric vis-a-vis ecology of Thar Parkar has been changed and is changing drastically. Recently, I think a couple of months back, a study came out that showed that now the water resources in Thar have elevated level of toxic metals, including arsenic, mercury, and lead. You don't need to be a chemistry nerd to know that these are not consumed for human consumption. This only confirms what the communities have known about their ecology and have been protesting for so long. In this specific situation, to refer to man-made climate change, what it is essentially resulting in is indigenous communities losing their land, losing their sense of self and belonging, but on top of that, being scrutinized into very militarized and securitized responses and techniques. All this development at the cost of who? Essentially, Thari ecology, Thari bodies who have essentially been living in peace and harmony with each other and the environment. Now, to come to the security part of it, in no way in this situation I'm making a causation or a correlation between climate crisis making this specific community your next terrorist targets. If anything, indigenous and local communities have and are suffering the most through the whole process of climate crisis that we are going through. I am trying to bring home the point that our identities and our bodies are connected to the land we come from. this deprivation of land and territory from land-based communities results in a systematic loss, but I will go as far as to say erasure of traditional knowledge across generations. It leaves us vulnerable with intergenerational trauma. Now, we need to acknowledge in this whole conversation that ecological grief is very much part of this whole climate experience. It is the grief that we experience when we are losing our lands and when we are losing the ways of life, traditional ways of being. Not just goes for me or the community I come from, but all of us. Our mental health is linked to the health of the earth, the health of the universe. Tharparkar in Pakistan is one of the regions with highest suicide rates. You can imagine with a lot of reasons, climate is one of them. In an already resource-scarce region marred with drought, man-made climate change is pushing locals to deprivation. So coming to the YEEP Fellowship, one of the reasons that came up in our research with other young people was that they have experienced some kind of trauma. They feel unsafe and threatened. And oftentimes there's such a stigma around mental health or even acknowledging the grief that is part of this experience. It's the mental health is inaccessible. It's unaffordable for people. And I think in this room right now, I want to bring an alternative perspective that many people are talking about, that how can we talk more about mental health driven vulnerabilities, climate change driven vulnerabilities that essentially impact our mental health. And how can we all acknowledge the ecological grief that is very much part of the conversations around climate change and security as well. So Ishan, for now, I will leave it up to that. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Javeria. I think it's so interesting to hear this notion about ecological grief. I think that's a really powerful idea that you've shared, and how that might contribute directly, in fact, to the increased vulnerability of young people to all kinds of really extremism. I want to stay with you, Javeria, and ask you a follow-up question, which is, now we've heard about yours and Dennis's experience, and what you know of your communities and others around you. What can we do about it, right? So how can we engage young people in addressing climate security in the context of PCVE? And what would be some of young people's recommendations to do this?
Thank you for that. I would say that I have two recommendations. So one is more macro and another is more micro. On a macro level, I urge governments in this room, everyone listening and who are decision makers, to embody a preventive approach. Which should not be led by securitization agenda. We do not need more securitization response in this nexus. According to the Center of Feminist Foreign Policy, if the world's military's greenhouse emissions were bundled together to represent that of a single country, they would stand at the fourth largest national carbon footprint in the world. That needs to be a conversation. We need to be essentially more creative and innovative. The current Westphalian system, the climate change crisis does not fit into that. So when an issue does not fit into a box, you cannot expect the solutions to come out of that box. What I am asking in this moment is for us to be more creative, more innovative, and co-create with young people. Because essentially, at the end of the day, my generation has to live with it, and so does the next generation. If you are not involving us in these conversations, I guess that's my biggest, more macro level. Avoid securitization, involve young people, co-create with them. And on more micro level, I would say preserve cultures as a mental health strategy, because there are so many ways of life that are dying, and there are so many ways of life that will die, whether we have reached that acceptance or not. How can we preserve those things? In deep research, what came up was that one of the drivers of violent extremism can be lack of belonging. And when so much of your land is who you are, now imagine what happens when you see that kind of crumble in front of you. Where some societies perceive land as a commodity, for many communal societies, historically, land has had a sacred relationship with our culture, our values, our ancestors, or as we call it, like our mitti. So I think we need to start thinking about more micro in terms of how do we preserve, and that in itself will bring this sense of belonging, will act as a mental health strategy at large. And yeah, I guess I will leave it up to that for now.
Thank you, Javeria. Dennis, same question to you.
Thank you, Sian. Similarly, in those lines, I would like to also share my experience so that I can come with the concrete recommendations. So basically, I would like to tell the audience here that young people can definitely be innovators and facilitators at the crossroad of climate security, conflict prevention, and peace building. So I've worked with more than 1,000 children and young adults affected by conflict in the remote and peripheral areas of the northeast of India bordering Myanmar. And from my experience, I can tell you that I have learned the urgency of engaging young people beyond dialogue so that their aspiration of their future remains vital. But if we do not respond to this urgency, we are going to lose a generation full of potentials and opportunities to achieve the transformational progress that the world needs. Because of the recent displacement due to in my region, we have with my peers initiated Mission Sui Kom, which means teaching lives together in the Zo indigenous language, where we support indigenous young people to try to give them voice to the possibilities of building their future. So in those processes, we can co-create solutions if they are empowered to mitigate conflicts. And we indigenous youths remain hopeful. And on behalf of those indigenous youth, I would like to present some recommendations that requires people in this audience their persistent effort and intervention. So I urge the United Nations and the global community to create platform for the integration of indigenous and tribal knowledge in climate security and PCVE efforts, relying on young people contribution. That's going to be my first recommendation. Secondly, I call for governments to implement robust bottom-up participation mechanisms at community level to elevate the voices of vulnerable youths in PCVE efforts. Here it could be ex-combatants and other vulnerable young people. Thirdly, I would like multi-stakeholder efforts I would call for multi-stakeholder efforts to increase young people's access to funding, which is so required, and resources to prevent violence related to climate security. And fourth, which is really close to my heart, I urge for a whole society approach to educate and mentor young people on how to lead conversations around climate security or PCV. I believe, and since I am an alumni of the UNCCT peer-to-peer model, it is one of the right tools to engage especially young people as it works on informed and participatory approach. So using P2P model, especially in my region, the place that I came from, particularly South Asia, we could empower and enable vulnerable, marginalized, or the lesser heard young voices. And through our initiative, working with conflict displaced youth, the P2P model has given them a significant role in meaningful engagement towards PCV as they feel heard, included, and their perspective really taken into account. So if you allow to me, I would like to inform the audience that every young people's pulsates with hope, and that is the hope that drives young people like me, our minds and our actions. Our institutions, our policy, our systems will be only strong when government listen and take young people as partners. So the road to peace, stability, and security will not be an easy one, I assure you. But if leaders keep on banking on us that young people is at the table, but we should ask young people, rather, you should ask people like me, what kind of table we want? Like, do we want a bigger table, a larger table? Do you want a new one? So that is a question that we young people would like to be asked, because a seat at the table is not enough, and to create solutions. And I urge people like in the audience, particularly, and people who are taking leadership positions in institutions and systems, to empower us by giving us the ownership to let our hopes be driven and our dreams, so that we can drive our dreams. But last of all, listen to us, engage with us, entrust us, enable us so that we can build a secure and sustainable world. But only if you listen with your heart and if you believe in us as young people. So please accept, Excellencies and my dear friends and the global committee. This is my humble submission for you to reconsider of young voices like me who live in the peripheral areas and in the remote borderlands of the northeast of India, because we hope, and I think that hope is something that is vital for us to transform this world. Thank you, Sian. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dennis and Javeria. And we've unfortunately run out of time, but I think there's no greater pitch for meaningful youth engagement in climate security and preventing and countering violent extremism than what you've both just provided. So I will, with that, end that panel and pass over to my colleague from UNICRI. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sian, and thank you also from our side to our wonderful speakers online for their powerful and moving words. So with that, we're moving into the final segment of our side event. And, you know, up till now, we've heard a lot about the problems, the challenges we face, and we've heard directly and indirectly from those who've been affected. We wanted to end on a positive note, or an optimistic or constructive note, looking somewhat forward in terms of what we can do, as well as some of the tools and the technologies that are available to help us to address some of these challenges. So with that, it's a pleasure to introduce to all of you our colleague, Professor V.S. Subramanian. V.S. is the Walter P. Murphy Professor of Computer Science and Buffett Faculty Fellow at Northwestern University, where he heads the Northwestern Security and AI Lab, which is one of the first to develop artificial intelligence for counterterrorism purposes. The Northwestern Security and AI Lab has developed the PCORE, the Pastoral Conflict Reasoning Engine, which is a system that allows policymakers at the nation, state, province level to assess the risk of low-level conflicts in fine-grained regions within their countries. VS will tell us a little bit about this tool, some of the results from their testing of this tool in 5 Central African countries, and how this system might itself be of relevance for us in the counterterrorism and PVE world. So with that, over to you, VS.
Thank you, Oren. It's a pleasure to be here, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll move on to the next slide, please. So I don't think I really need to repeat the fact that climatic changes are causing displacement patterns, both amongst herders as well amongst fishers and others. So conflict tends to occur when herders cross the boundaries of farms that are owned by farmers, which in turn end up, getting eaten by the livestock involved. So what I'm going to do is to tell you about how we've been using AI. If we can go to the next slide. PCORE, our Pastoral Conflict Risk Engine, basically takes a country, divides it up into cells. We can divide it up into cells of whatever size we like. In this talk today, I'll talk about cells of size 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer, but earlier I heard, I think, the folks from IEP talking about approximately 55 by 55 kilometer cells and so forth. We use machine learning techniques to automatically generate these kinds of risk maps, but we also provide methods by which we can explain what's going on. So for today, I'm primarily going to talk about the Central African Republic, but we've done this for 5 countries: Burundi, Chad, Cameroon, and the DRC. If we may go to the next slide, please. So what's our methodology? Now, before, let me just say that for those of you who are not familiar with machine learning, it sounds like some kind of, black magic. It's not. What machine learning is trying to do is to take objects, in this case cells of a country, and use some independent variables associated with those cells, in order to predict an outcome. So the goal at the end of the day is to learn some condition on the independent variables such that when the condition is true, the outcome we are trying to predict, such as pastoral conflict in this case, happens with high probability. When the condition is false, it happens with very low probability. The greater the spread, in some sense, the better that condition is distinguishing between when the event happens versus when it does not. So in our case, we gathered our methodology. We gathered data about pastoral conflicts in these 5 countries. We gathered weather data. When I say we gathered, I mean, obviously we built on top of what others in the community have done. So I was not busy gathering satellite data myself. We use satellite data from other sources, historical data, as well as data about the ground itself, terrain, land use, etc. So our independent variables fall into these three broad categories: weather, historical data, such as past occurrences of conflict, on the grounds that if someplace had experienced a lot of conflict in the past, it might continue to do so in the future. The third step is to learn machine learning models from this data. And then the fourth is to visualize and make these predictions available via a graphical user interface. I actually had a slide with a video clip showing you the system in about 2 minutes, but I was told it couldn't quite be played here. So, if you wish, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I'd be happy to shoot you a copy of the video. So the part that's in red, which is write up the results, is stuff we're doing as we speak. So academia requires we do this with all the I's dotted, T's crossed, and so that takes a lot more time sometimes than actually doing the work. So if we continue, so again, the goal, given a cell of a country, is it going to experience pastoral conflict? And can we predict this based on weather, ground, and his past history? If we continue to the next slide, please. We can do this pretty well. So AUC here is something different from a violent extremist group. It's area under a receiver operating characteristic curve. It's a classic metric to measure the performance of a predictive model. And we looked at this. One thing about machine learning is we never know which algorithm is going to work well till we try them all on a piece of data. So anytime anybody tells you they're going to use machine learning to give you great results, don't believe it till you see it. And so we didn't know which algorithm would work either. And but as you can see with the numbers, which should go between 0 and 1, we can do pretty well. And but one thing you'll notice is that 3 different algorithms produce the results. So the best result for Cameroon was generated by an algorithm that's different from the best result for the Central African Republic, which in turn is different from the best algorithm for something else. So really, there's a huge experimental component to this. You've really got to pound on the data and figure out what's working well. So knowing which cells, somebody will say, well, gee, if you can predict which cells are going to experience pastoral conflict, that doesn't really explain why. So I'm going to take a model that you don't see as the best in the last column here, in any of the 4 countries, and try and explain what's going on, at least in the case of the Central African Republic, just to give you an idea of what these models look like. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is a different model called a decision tree. Some of you may have seen this before. Decision trees are an early form of machine learning. They've been around for a while. And what you see in this picture is a bunch of nodes. It's structured as a tree, so the root, I'm sorry to say in computer science, root is always at the top, not at the bottom. And things flow downward. So if you look at this little, I don't know if you can see those red dotted lines. And I'm going to show you, if you follow that red path from the top node, the root node, what it tells you is that if a cell had less than or equal to, in this case, 5.5 conflicts in the past, and the relative humidity in that cell is less than or equal to 0.05 approximately, and the surface soil wetness is less than or equal to 0.274, then, in fact, every single time a cell like this has been seen, you have seen conflict happening, pastoral conflict in this case, not other kinds of conflict. So farmer, herder conflict. And that's just one rule that you can read off this one decision tree by following that dotted red path. If I sort of go to the next slide, and sorry, let's go one more. Sorry, yeah, it's actually the same. I truncated this path here. So here, actually, if we can go back to the previous slide for a second. Here, I started from the root node, which is the total conflict count less than 1, went right to the RH2M5 node, went down, which is left, to the SSW8 node, and then went further left to a node shown in red. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to remove that, the last part. Can you go back to the next slide, please? This says, well, if a cell has previous slide. if the cell had 5.5 conflicts and the relative humidity was less than 0.05, there's a 75% probability that the cell is going to experience such a conflict. Now, the previous slide was 100%, but there were only 10 cases that supported it. This slide is 75%, a lower number, less discriminative, but it's got greater support. There are 16 cases which supported it. We don't really say one is better than the other. We put both those out there and say, look, by looking at what we expect is the weather forecast for the Central African Republic in, say, the month of July, those weather forecasts exist. We can say something about what we expect is going to happen there next month. If we continue, we can also use this to say here's another example, which also gives a similar scenario following the blue path. And let's continue to the next slide. Rather than just predicting when a cell will experience conflict, sometimes it's just as important to know when it's not going to experience conflict. So this last path in green, all the way along the left edge of the tree, gives you a condition under which no conflict is expected. And that is a case when there are 78 cells and only 1 out of 78 cells experienced a conflict when this condition was true. And that is a condition which says that when the cell had less than or equal to 5 conflicts in the past, and it had a leaf area less than 0.3 approximately, and skin temperature of the surface less than or equal to 0.15, there's a 98% probability that such a cell will not experience conflict. So the reason we want to be able to predict both when it'll happen and when it'll not happen is simply because we know that allocation of resources is greatly helped. When you don't expect anything to happen here, if I was, the head of New York PD, and I don't expect any problem here, I can move my resources, protective resources from here to some other place where I expect it to happen more frequently. I want to note again that this model, the decision tree model that's shown on the last 2 or 3 slides, is not the best performing model that you saw in the table a few slides back. And that is something that is, I'm just using this as a very simple way of explaining what's going on. Okay. So if we can continue, I think I'm pretty much at the end of my talk. What are we doing? We're sort of fine-tuning our risk models. We have similar results for the other countries. We have similar results at finer-grained resolutions than 100 by 100 kilometers. We've got it at 50 by 50, but not quite at 25 by 25. So I'd like to see how I trade off the performance as we get more and more fine-grained in terms of how finally we can predict where something's going to happen, where it's not. So to conclude, our lab at Northwestern, we started working on the use of AI for counterterrorism with a paper on Hezbollah going back to 2007. We published our first book on a machine learning model of Lashkar-e-Taiba in 2011 or 12. And we've continued working with data about a number of groups, including Boko Haram, for example, on which we wrote a book a couple of years back. So these models are publicly available. They all are based actually solely on open source data. And I'm happy to chat further about both work on climate-related conflict as well as other kinds of terrorist attacks afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, VS. Very interesting and exciting to see where advancement these technologies are going forward and how we can leverage them. We are just a little bit over time, so if you'll bear with us just a few minutes, we'll start wrapping things up. I have the pleasure to hand over now to Mr. Rafi Gregorian, Deputy to the Undersecretary General at UNOCT, and to my own Deputy Director, Mr. Leif Willitsen at UNICRI, to wrap us up for the day. So without further ado, Mr. Gregorian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, everyone online. I'm grateful to all of our speakers for their valuable contributions and insights. I wish I could have come a little bit earlier. I got a real flavor of it just coming in at the end. And I thought you said we were going to be optimistic after that presentation, but I'm not so sure. Anyway, special thanks to the governments of Canada, Mozambique, and Norway for co-sponsoring this important and timely event. I would also like to thank our partners from UNICRI as well as the Institute for Economics and Peace Today's discussion produced an incredibly rich discussion on this emerging, complex, and multifaceted challenge. I haven't been here, so I'm not going to attempt to make an exhaustive summary, but I have been fed the information in the other event I was in, so I want to share with you what we've taken away from this. First of all, we have learned that the significant cost of climate change, specifically forced migration, malnutrition, and illness that can arise out of ecological degradation and the related escalation of conflict and global insecurity that can ensue. And I think just looking at your model now, I remember growing up and my mom observing like how often in the United States there were more riots in the summer than there were in the winter. You know, it's just sort of like a blinding flash of the obvious, but now we have the data. We have heard that in Iraq, the Lake Chad Basin, and Colombia, there is evidence linking livelihood challenges to armed group recruitment created and exacerbated by climate change. We've heard about the lived experiences of farmers, herders, and fishers in Chad who have reported increased stress on their ability to survive as a result of climate change impacts to livelihood activities. And you can see that on satellite data, the shrinking of Lake Chad, right? Competition for shrinking resources has led to increased conflict within and between communities, and terrorists have sought to instrumentalize these vulnerabilities for their own gain. UNOCT's youth leaders have shared their own personal experiences, shedding light on the deep connection between land, natural resources, and a sense of identity, belonging, and community, which, when broken, can impact vulnerabilities to violent extremism. You've considered how technological innovation can be considered a measure of resilience against the emerging intersection between climate security and violent extremism, particularly through the use of artificial intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, despite what has been learned today, we must better understand the linkages between climate change and violent extremism in order to address them. I know that from my own experience before joining the UN that the issue is one of lively debate within the Security Council about whether or not climate change is really even a threat to international peace and security. But first, while these findings are helpful, more research is needed to inform the development of robust PCVE policies and programming that can effectively integrate climate considerations and climate-based risk assessments. Second, we must be careful not to overly securitize this issue. As we heard today, we can develop climate-sensitive PCVE interventions, which include economic alternatives to climate-affected livelihoods and resilient agricultural practices. Access to alternative local justice mechanisms can also help address disputes over natural resources that are exacerbated by climate change. And lastly, while individual research and programming initiatives are important, there is an opportunity and a need for enhanced coordination and cooperation between the different actors tackling the issue to leverage existing knowledge and further understand how climate change might impact violent extremism. This includes engaging and enabling young people to drive solutions in this space alongside policymakers, academics, community leaders, and UN system actors. As the centerpiece of the UN's counterterrorism architecture, UNOCT stands ready to continue this important work with our partners. And with that, I would like to thank you all and the chair for inviting me to join you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grogan. Over to you now, Mr. Wilson.
Thanks a lot, Audrey. So, Excellencies, dear distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I know that we are running out of time, but please give me at least 1 minute. So I would like to echo, of course, Mr. Rafi Gregorian in thanking all the speakers for their insight contribution, excellent presentation, as well as our partners, the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, UNOCT, and the Institute for Economics and Peace for the successful collaboration in organizing this event, excellent event. I am also grateful, particularly grateful to the government of Norway, Canada, and Mozambique for co-sponsoring this event. I think, I believe that we can say that throughout the discussions today and also reflected in many of the research that we were listening to, the presentation, that one thing is evident is the impact of the climate change on the local livelihoods and how this increased competition for natural resources is leading to increased tension within the communities. And I believe that also the subsequent erosion of the social cohesion, and I think we heard that several times, that can easily increase the vulnerabilities to the radicalization and violent extremism is just yet another consequence, unfortunate consequence. As a specialized research and training institute of the United Nations, UNICRI, as you all know probably, supports member states in addressing crime-related challenges, including the prevention and countering of violent extremism. And through our action-oriented research, as we like to call it, and this is one of them, the knowledge exchange, the capacity-building initiatives, we work with national authorities, with civil society organizations to promote effective strategies. I think it was also presented by Manuela today. So it is within this framework and as part of these efforts that we have started our work aimed at improving the knowledge on the interlinkage, the nexus between climate insecurity and violent extremism. And of course, UNICRI stands ready to continue this, I think, very critical work, in particular working to translate the theory, our knowledge, our research into practice, into programming and future programming, as I think we discussed several times, through the activities that we also envisage as part of the next phase of our climate and security-related work, and of course in particular with the UN entities such as UNOCT, UNIVOS in the Sahel region, and the member states partners. I'm aware that the presentation probably triggered a lot of questions. I was told by Audra and my colleague that I should apologize. We were supposed to have a Q&A session. I hope we can have it next time, but of course you're more than welcome to send us the question. We will be happy to get back to you, of course. So on this note, let me extend my sincere gratitude to each and every one of you in the room and online for having joined this important side event and for the inspiring discussion and again, extremely interesting presentation. I thank you all. Thank you.